have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hammond, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to the second hour of the show, Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting still from the City of Angels, or some people call it the City of Demons. As you just heard, we have the one and only Mr. Uri Geller, live from Tel Aviv, Israel. If anybody out there ever has a chance to see him in person, I highly recommend it. He is a great motivational speaker these days, and obviously he has a lot of history with his magic, and some even say of the psychic powers he has. If you actually go onto our YouTube channel, remember folks, everything is the name of the show, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. You could start with the website, drjradiolive.com, but YouTube, again, DRJ Radio Live. You could see and hear the last Uri Geller interview where he did on the phone that very special trick he does, where he makes the time stop on all clocks and watches near you. If you want to be part of that experiment, check it out, because people have even said that in the replays of that show, when they didn't even know it was live, their clocks stopped. And that really mystified me. So I'm curious how you folks do about that. Now, we are about to switch gears. First of all, let me plug this in as well. As you know, we do have for the first Patreon patron I want to give a shout out to, which is A.A. Nakamura from Hawaii, and of course Pam Vrettenberg, another social media person who has been helping us, and also the networks that we are syndicated in, because this is an international radio show and we are bringing you intelligence to the discussion. World-class radio, world-class guests, internationally syndicated. And of course, we start with Late Night in the Midlands, right here in the United States, along with Black Swamp Digital Radio. And in the UK, we have Deprogrammed Radio Network, along with World Pirate Radio Network in Seoul, South Korea. That's absolutely right, folks. More than half the listeners are not even in the United States or North America. How about that one? Okay, so let's talk about the guests we have for this second half of this show. We bring you Mr. Mack Maloney. He's written over 50 books, and he's done a lot of amazing research about UFOs in wartime. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest, Mr. Maloney. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doctor. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's going to be a pleasure, and I know, just as with all guests, we will absolutely run out of time before we talk about all the vast knowledge you have, and I know you're going to be a recurring guest, because the times we've been talking leading up to the show, I can tell you're a really cool guy. So, let me start with this. There was a term that stuck out in my head, and just for you folks out there, assuming we don't get to all of it, we are going to focus on the period of 1909 until the first Gulf War. That's over 80 years worth of information. So, 1909, Mac, let me ask you about scare ships. What are they? Where were they? And what the heck was going on? Because this is 5 years before the First World War, and as people were calling it then, the Great World War.
Right. What they were, no one knows yet, but what people saw was in 1909 in the UK, in England, on a spring night, this cop was walking a beat somewhere in a city outside of London, and he saw this very large kind of airship go over him. It was about 300 feet long, so the size of a football field. It made very little noise. It was very low, but it was moving very fast. So he was like the first person to kind of see this. And then he made a report and it got into the media, and all of a sudden people are seeing this thing all over England. Now, as you say, it's 1909, and it's 5 years before World War I. And at first people thought that these things were Zeppelins. Now, the Germans did have Zeppelins, but they only had them at that time in 1909. They would only fly them from tethers, okay? They wouldn't let them go free. And they just weren't, as advanced enough to make the round trip from Germany down to England, turn around and go back to Germany. They hadn't reached that point yet. That they did reach about 5 or 6 years later. Anyway, so people would see these things, and they also saw that they were moving very fast. I mean, at some point they were making like 3 to 350 knots. That's really fast. Like these days, blimps can only go about 50, 60 miles an hour. These things are really moving, and some media people there back then actually tracked them, and they tracked them between sightings in one city to another, and then they did the math and found out that these things are going very, very fast. So people saw them all over the United Kingdom and Ireland, Northern Ireland, for about a year, half a year, and then they just kind of went away. But the things that would happen when people would see them, like the next day, people would see men in black, they looked like they were looking for something on the ground where underneath where people spotted these things. They were always reported to have very bright searchlights on their bottom, like shining down on the ground. As I said, go very fast. And anyone who thought, well, these are German spy ships, you would think, well, why, if they were German spy ships, in the unlikely event they were German spy ships, why would they have, searchlights? That's the last thing you want to do if you're a spy ship, So what they were, no one ever found out.
So now let me ask you this. Okay, and after these, obviously I would imagine it created a panic with people that were seeing that. What was the next significant thing that people started to see?
As far as things in the sky there in that era, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. So, the scare ships, came and went, and then there was World War I and so on. And then in the early 30s, there were these sightings of ghost planes in Upper Sweden. So if you can imagine the northern part of Sweden, close to the Arctic Circle, where there are scattered towns with very few people in them, and it's all tundra, and very, very difficult weather in the winter certainly, and even in the summer it's challenging, let's say. Well, people used to see these very strange airplanes flying over these isolated towns up there. They had 8 engines. They had twin tails, and they had pontoons, meaning they were some kind of aircraft that was designed to land on the water. Yet there was no water. There was ice, but there was no water. And people would see these things flying around. They would fly around mountains. They would fly around railroad stations. They would fly in blizzards. People would hear them flying, and then they'd hear their engines cut off, and then all of a sudden start up again. They would follow railroad tracks. There was more than one. People would see them flying in formation. These are like gigantic planes that, back in the early 30s, airplanes were still in their infancy in a way. And, a lot of airplanes back then were still cloth covered and stuff like that. A metal airplane, was a big deal back then. But now people are seeing these huge, huge planes, 8 engines. That's a lot of mechanics. So people saw them in Sweden for about a year and a half. The ghost flyers, that is how the Swedish people refer to them. And no one ever figured out what they were. Some people suspect they were Germans, but the Germans didn't have the technology at the time. No one knows what they were. And then they went away, just like the scare ships, they had their peak kind of, and then all of a sudden, boom, they were gone.
Now, I am familiar with things that happened decades later during World War II, and I've heard a few of the other airship mysteries that happened in a period before what you mentioned. But let's go dive into the First World War. I would think that based on the history that I've seen with these extraterrestrial craft or aliens, time travelers, whatever people want to call them, just UFOs because they're clearly unidentified, is that they seem to show up around major world events. So I would think that the Great War, as people called it at the time, and now we call it World War I, that they were probably watching some major battles. I mean, is that what your research has shown you?
Yes, it's I wrote this book a few years ago called UFOs in Wartime, and basically the idea is, do UFOs show up more in wartime than in peacetime? And it seems like, yes, they do. And, we wondered why it came about as over lunch with my editor, just kind of, throwing around ideas. And the idea is, well, in wartime, more people are flying, more people are on the ground looking up. Therefore, do more people see things that they can't identify in the air? Or is it this idea that, as you say, in great world events, UFOs are usually seen? And that's what it really seems like, especially during World War II. They called them the Foo Fighters back then, but they are what we would call these days UFOs, where, there'd be bombing missions in the middle of the night over some German city. And they'd see UFOs right off their wings. So, it was very strange. Who knows what the cause of it was, but there's a lot of documented evidence that, that's what happened.
Okay, so you mentioned the Foo Fighters, and that is a term that has been ingrained in my head for quite some time. The irony with the Foo Fighters is that the Allies thought that it was either the Germans, and the Germans thought it was us. So
right.
at what point do you think did your research tell you that they both realized, holy crap, this is not either of us?
Mm-hmm. Well, the whole thing started really, at the beginning of World War II, when the British started bombing Germany. And the British would bomb at night. And then, about almost a year later, the U.S. 8th Air Force came over from America to bases in England, and they started bombing during the day. So people, the RAF bombers at night would see these things all the time. And, any kind of bombing mission, when the crew would make it back, if they made it back, the entire crew would be debriefed by their section, their air units, intelligence officers. What did you see? What happened? How many fighters? How many bombs you think, landed on target, so on and so forth. It's just routine. And these people used to bring these things up. And that's, the name Foo Fighters, eventually came to kind of an umbrella term for all these things. But see, at the time, that the British, and then later on when the Americans came over and they started seeing these things in the daytime, the intelligence officers and the people who were like prosecuting the war, let's say, their number one priority was, we got to beat Germany. We got to beat them. These things are most likely are German secret weapons. The British were convinced they were German secret weapons. And once we win the war, we're going to find out what was going on here. But then when the war was over, and the Allies were actually able to debrief these German generals and Luftwaffe high officials and stuff, they're the ones who said, we saw them too. We thought they were your secret weapons. So, I can just imagine a scene where these people are sitting at a table and they're just looking back at each other with blank stares in their face. Like, wow, what were they? And then, then the Cold War began and, who knows, what kind of priorities they put on these things. But, that's what it was. And it was the same thing for the Japanese, too. That there was lots of Foo Fighters UFOs seen during the Pacific War. But the thing is that with the Pacific War, that was mostly the U.S. Navy. That was their war. In Europe, it was mostly, the Army. But the U.S. Navy really prosecuted the war in the Pacific. And even though the Army and the Air Force's files on Foo Fighters and UFOs have been made public, no one has ever gone into the World War II files of the Navy to see how many Foo Fighters they saw, what they thought about them, what photographs might exist or whatever. But, same thing, Japanese, and at the end of the war, they said, we saw them too, we thought they were your secret weapons. So, in the end, a lot of people saw them, but no one has any idea where they came from.
And that's a major thing right there. And I even heard a story that's actually post World War II, but has to do with, obviously, the Supreme Allied Powers, the shape. But that's a whole nother story about Robert Dean. But before we get into that, there was something major that happened in World War II that I was hoping I would get to the other night with Preston Dennett, but we really didn't. And we barely talked about it when Robert Morningstar was on. And that is the Battle of L.A. That happened right in the middle of World War II. Let's talk about that.
Well, it happened at the beginning of World War II. It happened on February 25th, 1942. Now, the Pearl Harbor had been bombed December 8th, 1941. And it's important to remember that World War II had been going on for quite a while, for 2 years before the United States got involved. So you have to imagine that Germany and England were fighting each other. Japan was fighting in China. The Russians were fighting the Germans, and the world was basically at war, and the United States had stayed out of it as long as they could.
Now,
so,
yeah, go on.
Okay. So I was going to say, so what happens? The Japanese, attacked Pearl Harbor, and then the next 2 or 3 months, a lot of people were convinced that the Japanese were going to invade the west coast of the United States. They thought they were going to invade the Hawaiian Islands, but maybe invade California. And there were Japanese subs off of California. They would shell oil refineries and stuff like that. So the enemy was out there. But anyway, on this particular night, the Navy said that there was a report that in L.A., over L.A., that there would be that a Japanese air raid was coming in, over L.A. And the thing is that Los Angeles isn't what Los Angeles is today. There's about 2 million people, and there were a lot of defense plants there around Burbank, as it turns out. So these things had anti-aircraft weapons and so on. So they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and there's air raid sirens going on, and there's air raid wardens in the streets. Everyone's ready, and then people start seeing these lights coming on. They started to track them up the coast, and they came right over LA, and these anti-aircraft batteries started shooting at them, and this goes on for almost 2 hours. There was so much anti-aircraft fired that the shells, the fragments of the shells fell down on Los Angeles and killed 6 people, and destroyed cars and burnt down buildings, the works. People said that they were seeing these anti-aircraft shells hit these objects, and these things were bouncing off. Now, here's the strange thing is that at the time in Los Angeles, there were 7 daily newspapers, if you could believe it. And the reporters from all of them found out that the Navy expected an air raid that night. And so they were all stationed on top of these tall buildings in Los Angeles. And these guys had binoculars and stuff, and they were writing stuff down, verbatim. And lots of people saw these objects going over L.A. So they had this huge battle. As I say, so many fragments came down to the ground and killed people and did a lot of property damage. There's a photograph that someone took that's owned by the LA Times. I know because I had to pay about $500 to put it in the book, of a huge flying saucer over Los Angeles. It's caught in searchlights. I mean, it happened. They went away. The next day, the Army said that they were. The Army thought that they were airliners that there were bombers disguised as airliners, Japanese bombers disguised as airliners, and they had taken off at a secret base in Mexico. The Navy said that it was just they don't know who was over Los Angeles that night. And then later on they said, later that day they said it was just people with itchy trigger fingers on these anti-aircraft weapons, which cannot be true. Because so many people saw them, so many people were shooting at them, and then later on the next day they put a warrant, the War Information Act or whatever. They embargoed all news about it, and boom, and then World War II goes on, and people forgot about it. But it actually happened. About 1 million people saw these things over L.A. At the end of the war, they asked the Japanese, "How did you get to L.A.?" And they said, "We never did it. We didn't have aircraft carriers that could make it past Hawaii. There's no way we could, do some kind of operation to bomb L.A." So it's one of these things that's just been kind of forgotten. I think the military would prefer it was forgotten, but no one ever figured out what these things were.
You're absolutely right, and I got really sad how they always say the stupidest stuff, wartime jitters. Yet the cover of the LA Times. I have a really great book, by the way. It's it's more than 100 years. It goes back to the very first LA Times ever, which didn't even have photography, even though photography was available at the time. And they had hand drawn of what downtown looked like. And so instead of having every single cover, which would be pretty much impossible because it has over 100 years worth, it has very famous ones like the famous one of Jap surrender, the Titanic sank, and of course it has the Battle of Los Angeles. Now, if people are they should be at this point very familiar with the image that appeared on the cover of LA Times. But for the first time the other day, seeing that very same image with different color contrasts, I finally got to see how the craft looked like. I want everybody to know that where the lights are hitting it, you're not if you don't know the shape of it, you're actually only seeing a portion of it. It's actually a triangular craft. And like I said, if everyone out there does a little digging and just searches through the different photographs, it's pretty obvious. Yeah, that you're looking at the right sort of upper right of it in some sense. Now, here's a big thing. And the first time I ever knew that there was more than one retrieval was actually when they first released Ancient Aliens as a 6-part series, 2 hours each, when they covered Battle of LA. And one of the witnesses said that we shot 2 of them down. One fell in the ocean and one in, I believe, Santa Monica Mountains. Can you talk about what you know, what your research led you about those?
Yeah, those, with any kind of story like this, is always like kind of side stories. Some of them are true and some of them aren't. It's very unlikely that in fact, there was no airplanes in the air that night of our airplanes, because they knew, even though there was an air base nearby, several of them, in fact, that could have sent up, what we would call these days interceptors, P-40 interceptors. They didn't want to do that because they knew there was so much anti-aircraft fire up there, they didn't want to shoot down their own planes. So there were these balloons that they would send up over defense plants. You see them in a lot of photos of England during the Blitz, where you would send up these big balloons that would prevent aircraft from flying low and bombing, a factory or whatever. But those were up, but no airplanes, no interceptors or fighters went up like at Pearl Harbor, where, some of our planes did go up and engage the Japanese. In this case, it didn't happen because, once again, there's too much AA fire up there. They didn't want to shoot down their own planes.
Yeah. And you know what? That's a huge problem, because I would not be surprised, since there was I know one book that came out, I think it was in the 50s, called Shoot Them Down, about us trying to shoot down different things, because the standing order for a long period of time was to do whatever you can to get some of these craft down. But I would imagine that in that process, we shoot some of our own down. So obviously that's a very dangerous game to play. Now, sticking on to World War II, let me ask you this. Has there been any other sightings that happened on the American shores after the Battle of LA?
No, that's what's strange about it, is that, there were a few instances where people saw UFOs off of the coast of California during World War II, but nothing nothing as intense or extensive as over the battlefields of World War II. So that kind of led to our theory. It seems like UFOs are appearing, but my theory is that, there's a good chance that they're time travelers. They're time tourists. They're people from our far future who are able to come back in time and witness historic events. Because the whole idea of UFOs or these foo fighters, flying off the wings of British bombers that are bombing, a German city in the middle of the night, they're not interfering. No, there's no shooting back and forth or any of that stuff. It just looks like they're observing. And, and this idea, and I'm not the first one to come up with it, but this idea that time travelers would come back, time tourists would come back and observe historical events. I mean, if we lived 1,000 years in the future, who wouldn't want to come back and see stuff, So that idea kind of appeals to me in a way. They're just observing us. They're watching history as it's being made.
Agreed. And that's a very, very major thing. Now, let's jump to anything else that was seen in that period after now, anywhere around the world. And what else people confused it to be other than the enemy's jets or enemy advanced fighters, because obviously there was a lot of myths going around about super weapons that the Nazis had.
Right. The Nazis had super weapons, but they didn't really have super weapons. I mean, they had advanced weapons, and so did the Allies. This whole idea that the Nazis had help from aliens, and that the Nazis had UFOs, and the Nazis, had all this kind of these super weapons that would be really kind of, crazy even today. It's all myth. It's all not true because, when you think about it, well, if they had all this alien help, why would they lose the war? Why'd they lose the war if they had, extraterrestrial help? But they did invent the first jet. They did invent the first ballistic missile. The United States Army, right at the end of World War II, they went and they quote unquote, not captured, but they took in a lot of German scientists, Werner von Braun being one of them, and about 300 German scientists, forgot about their Nazi credentials, brought them to the United States, and they're the foundation of NASA. Anyone who, it sounds crazy, it sounds like conspiracy, but Nazi scientists put the United States on the moon because the foundation NASA back then were Nazi scientists, So, but as far as, other things seen, people used to see flying saucers. They'd see cigar-shaped objects. They'd see bright lights. They'd see, things that look triangle-shaped. They'd see things that look like kind of like, fighters, but from the future or something. Lots of people saw lots of things, but during war, it's chaotic. People don't know, what's going on and so on. So they were kind of like forgotten in the history of the thing.
Yes, definitely agreed. So now let's jump a couple decades to another war, a very sad one because, well, hold on. Before I even get to Vietnam, let me talk to you about Korea. Obviously, again, another massive bloody war. And I would think that, people were seeing things as well.
Well, the Korean War is really, it's funny because it's kind of pivotal in the history of UFO history. Because in the 5 years between World War II and Korea, two things happened. First of all, we became a jet-powered military. Propeller planes in World War II, jets for the most part in Korea. Number two, these jets would have radar on the jet itself. In World War II, you had radar on the ground and in some kind of big planes, but now by the 50s, they've been able to compact radar to the point where they could put it in jet fighters and put it in just about anything. So there was a lot of UFOs spotted over Korea. And what's interesting about it is that, you have radars on the airplanes, you have radars on the ground, you have radars on ships out at sea. And when all three of these electronic eyes see a UFO, and then human eyes are seeing a UFO, there's a good chance it's a UFO. Suddenly you have electronic evidence for it that you didn't have in World War II. So lots of people, so there were a lot of instances where UFOs were seen over Korea. The Air Force's official stand was anyone who saw a UFO must be, insane or a religious fanatic. And all of a sudden their pilots are seeing them, and they knew that they couldn't say that their pilots were, insane or religious fanatics. So that's what really started the U.S. Air Force to start Operation Blue Book, which is just this kind of, quasi kind of, research, unit looking into UFOs. They did some work. They ignored a lot of stuff. But if there wasn't so many UFOs spotted in the Korean War, Blue Book would never have happened. So Korean War is very important to UFO history.
Now, okay, Blue Book, yeah, that's actually, I'm glad. Let me say one quick thing about this because, yes, people know me just as Dr. J. However, when I started, I used almost my full name. My J is the initial for John, but Dr. J. Allen Hynek was actually the reason because I do have a doctorate as well. Not the same as him. He had a PhD in astronomy, where I have a JD, a Juris Doctor. Mm-hmm. But Dr. J. Allen Hynek, so I decided since my middle name started with an A, Andy, I figured Dr. J. Andy Elias, but now it's just Dr. J. Little thought I wanted to throw out there. Yeah. So Blue Book always fascinates me, and I'll tell you why. Because that Dr. J. Allen Hynek came in with some of the most ridiculous crap. I'm talking about the explanations he's used, from swamp gas to this and that.
When he worked, right?
Yes, yep. But when he finished, he became one of the biggest advocates. Rest his his soul. I mean, may he rest in peace now. I do wish he was still around to grill. But if that wasn't enough evidence for people to start really turning around saying, hey, look, the guy who was there to debunk him on behalf of the Air Force ended up being the person who was, someone who was helping us, I think is a fantastic. Yeah,
it's true. He's a fascinating guy, and I'm waiting for someone to write a really good biography on him, or maybe a movie or whatever, because he was the guy, as you say, the Air Force hired him to debunk all these, very kind of extreme UFO cases, and that's all Blue Book did. What they would do is they would go through. It wasn't this big, prestigious, huge building or anything. It was like 4 or 5 people, and people would write into them. And they would say, oh, I saw a bright light on September 3rd, at this time of night. I live in Georgia, blah, blah, blah. And they would just look and they would say, well, Venus was bright at that time. And they'd write back to the person, you saw Venus, okay? But, people said they saw a formation of flying saucers doing this and, doing all these aerobatics and stuff that, defied physics. Blue Book would just ignore it. They only responded to the ones they could actually, give an explanation for, whether it's right or wrong. But there was so many things in their file that they couldn't explain, and those are the ones that everyone should be interested in. You know what I mean?
Yes, agreed. Definitely agreed. Now, I do want to spend the next 10 minutes wisely since we are coming down to the end, and I want to have enough time for you to plug in your different stuff. So let's talk about some other battles leading up to the present, which obviously gets into the first Gulf War. But even before that, anything else you want to talk about? If something happened at Panama or Grenada or any of those?
Well, I'll tell you, a lot of things happened in Vietnam, too. We were talking a little bit about this off air, is that, a lot of UFOs were seen in Vietnam. Vietnam is such a difficult war, even just to talk about it is crazy, But there was this incident very quickly in Vietnam in the late 60s where, U.S. radar was picking up what they called enemy helicopters over the DMZ. And between, for those who don't know, between North Vietnam and South Vietnam during the war in the 60s and 70s, there was this 30-mile strip called the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which no one was supposed to go into, but the North Vietnamese were going into it regularly. So, radar started picking up these objects, and which they called enemy helicopters, but anyone who knows the history of Vietnam knows that the North Vietnamese didn't fly helicopters. But anyway, they moved these F-4 Phantoms up to the north of South Vietnam, and this one particular night when these objects were picked up on radar, these F-4 Phantoms were launched, and they're chasing these radar blips. They go off into the Gulf of Tonkin, which is the water off of Vietnam, and ships had been asked to kind of keep an eye out for strange, blips on their radar screens over the ocean, over the water. This Australian ship was out there, the HMMS Hobart. They picked up these blips, and all of a sudden, the Hobart was attacked with missiles, killed 3 sailors, injured 40 of them, 40 more. And what it was is that these F-4 Phantoms were shooting at these radar blips, and the missiles actually hit the Australian cruiser by mistake. No one ever explained it. The Australians looked into it, and they really kind of played up the UFO angle. The United States, the Air Force did not, of course. No one ever explained exactly what was going on, but, just all the people have researched it. There's no other real explanation. These American jets were chasing UFOs. They fired missiles at them. The missiles hit this Australian destroyer and killed 3 guys, and damaged the destroyer to the point where it was eventually sunk as like an artificial reef off of Australia, that type of thing. That's a really big sighting. There's a lot of sightings in Vietnam, but that one kind of sticks out. After that, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of UFOs showed up over ICBM bases in the United States. That's a whole other thing. You could do an entire show on that. A lot of people saw them. Sometimes they would switch off the ICBM's targeting facilities, switch off their power and stuff like that. Peter Jennings, a few years before he died, did a special on ABC about UFOs, and he talks extensively about that and interviews people in the Air Force who admitted that it happened. And then we were at the Gulf War, the first Gulf War.
Now, this is a question that someone really wants to know. If throughout all the things that we talked about, was there ever a time during wartime that somebody saw actual beings, non-terrestrial beings on the ground?
Yeah, good question. No, the answer is no.
Ah,
they saw things
very
in the
telling.
sky. Yeah,
Very,
they saw
very,
things in the
very
sky.
telling. Okay,
Right.
so now let's go into, I guess, any other more that you would think of that it just would happen up to any of the other recent wars. Anything else you got for the next 5 minutes?
The UFOs in wartime, we did like basically the 20th century. So we ended it on the first Gulf War in 1991. A lot of things seen. I mean, if you remember, like in 1990, August 2nd of 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. And at the time, 90% of the people in the United States didn't know where Kuwait was, frankly. And but it's a major oil producer. He was trying to grab the oil. So we did this thing called Operation Desert Shield, which the first part of it was moving all American troops and Allied troops over to Saudi Arabia, and they're basically going to invade Kuwait and take it back from Iraq. But it took 6 months for this to happen. In this build-up to this war, which was like the first televised war, they had advanced bases in Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and all these places in the Persian Gulf, Middle East area. And as they're building up for this war, there were like really dozens and dozens of UFO sightings over these bases. And sometimes, it caused them to, launch fighters or whatever. But it really leads to this idea that whatever UFOs are, they're looking in on us. They kind of knew what was up. And then when the war actually happened, there were more. There were more UFO reports. People on the ground seeing a lot of UFOs. There was supposedly a dogfight between a UFO and an F-16 during a bombing run over Baghdad. Supposedly Saddam Hussein actually had his own Area 51 that we bombed a lot in the first Gulf War and in the second one. Just something around that area, and the area is kind of mysterious anyway because it's where civilization began and so on and so forth. And they have a long history of seeing strange lights in the sky. And in the first Gulf War, it continued. It didn't diminish.
Now, another thing to ask you. Was there any time when any craft disappeared as opposed to things that were just being observing us? So, for instance, I know there was other times like in the Bermuda Triangle, which whether people can attribute to the Bermuda Triangle or as an extraterrestrial event, of course, people have different theories. But do you recall any other time during wartime when American or any sorts of airplanes or submarines or ships just straight up disappeared off the face of this earth, never to be seen again?
Right. See, it's hard to do. It's hard to determine that in wartime because you can always say, well, if a ship leaves here and goes there, and it doesn't show up, then there's a chance it's been torpedoed or whatever. You'll never know what happened to it. Not really, because as I say, there's always an explanation for it. There are stories of ships all of a sudden disappearing in the Pacific during the war, also the Atlantic. But once again, were they torpedoed? We don't know. Of course, the famous story is, what side of the whole Bermuda Triangle when the 5 airplanes at the very end of World War II, went missing over Florida. Everyone knows the story. And in the Bermuda Triangle itself in the 20s and the 30s, well, all the time, there's been instances of ships just completely going missing, But nothing really in World War II or any of the wars that we cover in UFOs in wartime.
Now, I'm assuming one thing that you're going to get into next time is more research, since you have over 50 books, into maybe the most recent wars. Is that what's next on your agenda?
Well, I'll tell you what, the vast majority of those books are novels. I read a series called Wingman, which is about a fighter pilot, a Zen fighter pilot. It's been around for about 30 years. We're working on Wingman 19 right now. So a lot of these things are novels. The only nonfiction books really I've written are UFOs in Wartime, and the follow-up book was called Beyond Area 51. and about secret bases around the world other than Area 51. And what I've found out, and anyone who's written books out there will understand this, is that writing a nonfiction book really takes a lot of work. It takes 5 times as much work easily as a novel. Novel, you can make it all up. Nonfiction book, you have to do the research and so on and so forth. It's just like a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of this and that. So I don't know if I'm ever going to write another nonfiction book, I can tell you the truth.
Well, hey, you've written a hell of a lot of books, and now I'd like to, first of all, thank you for coming on the show. We definitely will do this again, but let me spend this time talking about where people can find your books, any websites you have, and I do know you mentioned a radio show.
Right. Just go on Amazon.com and, type in Mack Maloney, and you'll see all the books. We have a radio show that's syndicated just like yours, Mack Maloney's Military X-Files show. 2 hours a week where we really kind of get into the paranormal from the military's point of view. Foo Fighters, of course, but there's a lot of instances of ghost ships, ghost airplanes, haunted battlefields, and things like that. So we really get into that a lot.
Okay, and again, any specific places that you already mentioned, I guess, where to plug it in. Okay, well, let me I've given you a chance to say any final statements. Is there any other final words you want to give to people before
Sure.
I throw in all
MackMaloney.com is a good place to go, and a new book that just came out, which actually is a nonfiction book, as it turns out. Mack Maloney's Haunted Universe just came out this Wednesday. It's just a collection of all these very strange stories that I've gathered over the years. Once again, ghost airplanes, ghost ships, really crazy military X-Files, NASA conspiracies, things along that line. Just came out. You can buy that on Amazon.com, Mack Maloney's Haunted Universe.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank you, Mr. Maloney, for joining us. And first of all, let me thank some other people on here first. A.A. Nakamura, the first Patreon patron from Hawaii. I want to thank you again for being a patron. And Pam Brettenberg, thank you for your promotion. Again, I also want to thank the station managers, who also are the audio engineers of Late Night in the Midlands, Daryl and Katie Neely, as well as the owner, Michael Vara. I also want to thank Wise Frog from Black Swamp Digital Radio, Jaffe Ryder, World Pirate Radio Network, and in the UK, we got to thank JC for all the hard work he's doing taking this show and syndicating it. Remember, folks, all you need to know about the show is the name of the show. That is drjradiolive.com, DRJ Radio Live, at the @ symbol DRJ Radio Live for every social media account, including mine's, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, YouTube, Google+, even Gmail, although I don't check emails very often, and Patreon. Everyone, don't forget about Patreon, and please open a Minds account, subscribe to us, and if you want to hear these archives while they're still free, check them out on YouTube, folks, because soon enough, there will be a way for you to have your own subscription and have the ability to either download them and listen to them on your own free time or whatever you want. That is being worked on right now, and it'll be a lot cheaper than everybody else. But again, in the meantime, there are over 200 interviews available on YouTube that go back literally, I believe, to 2013, including some greats like the Jesse Marcel Jr. final interview, some very great interviews with some politicians like Senator Mike Gravel calling Edward Snowden a true American hero. Also, let me tell you what's going to happen the rest of this week, since you only get one guest at a time on our website. Tomorrow, we have Father Jack. And also, I do want to tell you, and he's an exorcist. That's going to be a great show that we're going to talk about. And then Wednesday, the Academy of Remote Viewing and Influencing, Arvari, Gerald O'Donnell, and he's going to go deep like Robert Morningstar. And Thursday, we got 2 guests. We got Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, hour 1 and hour 2, Robbie Thomas. Great shows, and of course you guys can always call and be part of the show. I normally don't give out the phone number, but you could feel free to check out the websites, either the station or my website. You'll see 2 phone numbers there, and we will always take you. We do take calls unscreened, on air, and live. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J, host of Dr. J Radio Live. I will see you tomorrow night. And with that being said, I am signing off. Good night.